This is the brand new Panasonic Lumix TZ300, and it might just be one of the few point-and-shoot camera designs that's actually still trying to do something genuinely useful. It's small enough to live in your pocket, it packs in a decently sized 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, and to top it all off, it has an optical zoom that's borderline ridiculous.
Oh yeah, ding dong.
Does that mean it's perfect? Well, no actually, for a few reasons we'll get onto in just a little while, but before I unload on this thing like a BBC at Bonnie Blue's recent shoot, let's start with the positives and discuss why I think this might be one of the most convenient compact cameras I've shot with in quite some time. Now, at its core, the Lumix TZ300 is a pocket-sized travel camera built around one very simple idea, and that's giving people something that's just as easy to use as their smartphone, but with way more reach and noticeably better image quality. And the way it does that is by combining a back-illuminated 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, which is significantly larger than what you'll find in your average smartphone, with a whopping 15 times optical zoom lens, giving you a full frame equivalent focal range of 24 to 360 millimeters, all in the palm of your hand. You've also got 5-axis image stabilization built in, which is a total godsend when you're fully zoomed in at 360 millimeters. It also shoots RAW, which is actually really nice, so if you're the kind of person, like me, who enjoys sitting in Lightroom for 3 hours tweaking a photo that no one will ever see, you've got that option too. And to top it all off, you've got things like 4K video, decent burst shooting, and the usual manual controls if you actually want to take things a bit more seriously. So I think you'll agree, on paper at least, this thing already ticks a lot of boxes, but the question is, how well does it all come together in a real world environment? Well, using this camera is weirdly straightforward, in a good way. You kind of just pick it up, turn it on, and start shooting, which I suppose is the entire point of a point-and-shoot camera, so congratulations Panasonic, it looks like you've nailed the brief on this one. It's small, lightweight, and easy to carry around, which means you'll actually bring it with you, which is exactly what I did on a recent 2-week trip back to the UK to visit family and friends, and honestly, having this thing along for the ride was an absolute joy for the most part. Not just because it's a great little dad cam, but it's also surprisingly decent for things like street photography too. Now that's partly because the 24mm wide end is perfect for candid style shoots, but also because it looks basically like a tourist camera. So absolutely no one pays you any attention when you're using it, which is ideal if you enjoy shooting in incognito mode without looking like a complete creep. Obviously, for me, it's going to take a lot more than a small camera to stop me looking like a total creep, but for normal people, I'd imagine this would work pretty well. The grip on the front here, although not massive, is actually pretty comfortable, even for larger hands. And the controls are all well laid out and easy to get your head around. You've got a proper mode dial on the top here and a command dial, as well as a control ring around the lens here, which makes adjusting things like aperture and shutter speed really quick and easy without breaking your flow. Stabilization is also doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. Even when you're fully zoomed in, you can still get usable shots handheld without it looking like you're having a mild seizure. But as I alluded to at the beginning of this video, it's not all smooth sailing, because across the board, this isn't the fastest camera to use. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't struggling to get an erection after 40 levels of slow, but it's also not exactly keeping up with the pace of your ADHD thoughts kind of fast, if you catch my drift. For example, the zoom is a touch on the slower side. Now, it's far from being unusable, but definitely not snappy, which can get frustrating if you're trying to react quickly. The autofocus is a similar situation. For static subjects or slower scenes, it's absolutely fine and will nail the focus most of the time. But unfortunately, it does feature an older Lumix AF system, and it does show when shooting things that are faster moving, like kids, wildlife, or sports. It's a bit like having a wank to a photo of Margaret Thatcher. It's not completely impossible, just more of a challenge than you'd perhaps expect. Now that said, none of that really ruined the experience for me, and no, we're not talking about the wank, we've moved back onto the camera now, so try and keep up. No, what did make me question my sanity, however, is the EVF, or rather, the complete lack of one. Now on paper that might not sound like a big deal because plenty of cameras these days don't have EVFs. But when you realise that the previous model, the TZ200, actually did have one built in, you start to wonder what the hell Panasonic were thinking by removing it. Especially when one of the biggest complaints people have about modern camera designs these days is that the manufacturers keep removing EVFs. So to purposefully take one out of a camera design that already exists feels a bit strange strange to say the least. And to make matters slightly worse, there's no tilting screen either. This is actually fixed in place. Now, granted, that was also the case with the older TZ200, but that does mean that if you want to shoot from waist level or above your head, you're basically just guessing and hoping for the best, which coincidentally is also how I like to perform in the bedroom. Now, I suppose you could argue that since this is aimed at people who are perhaps upgrading from a smartphone, the lack of an EVF or tilting screen probably won't bother them all that much. And to be fair, that's a completely reasonable take. But if you're a more experienced shooter looking for a compact everyday carry-along, this one might make you feel slightly shortchanged. But with all of that said, and all of my bitching and moaning out of the way, this is still a very simple, convenient, and genuinely enjoyable camera to use. And speaking of simple, convenient, and genuinely enjoyable experiences, that reminds me of today's sponsor, Henson Shaving. You see, for years I actually avoided wet shaving entirely, not because I loved using an electronic razor, but because I convinced myself that wet shaving was some kind of ancient masculine ritual that was passed down from father to son, which in my case never actually happened, but I'll save that conversation for my therapist. So I just assumed that wet shaving would be fiddly, uncomfortable, and a great way to remove half of my face before work. Well, it turns out I was totally wrong. The problem was never wet shaving, it was actually that I never found the right razor. But thanks to Henson Shaving, I've completely changed my mindset when it comes to shaving. Their AL13 razor holds a single blade with ridiculous stability and locks you into the correct shaving angle automatically. You physically can't press too hard and can't mess it up unless you actively try. That means less irritation, less redness, and for the first time ever, shaving stopped feeling like a dangerous excursion I had to try and survive. But don't just take my word for it. Now is a great time to try it for yourself, because if you use the link in the pinned comment below, Henson are currently offering 100 free blades with the purchase of one of their razors. That'll give you about 2 to 3 years of shaving, well, unless you've got the facial hair of a Yeti with a hormone issue. But anyway, back to this camera, and now let's take a look at the image quality, because it's all fine and dandy this being a good camera to shoot with, but if the images look like a Windows 95 desktop background, it's probably not worth your time. And thankfully, they don't. In fact, for a camera like this, the image quality is actually pretty solid. That 1-inch sensor is doing exactly what you would hope it would, giving you noticeably more detail, better dynamic range, and cleaner images than you would expect to get from your smartphone. At the 24mm end, things look nice and sharp, even when shooting wide open, with plenty of detail. So no real complaints there. But as you start zooming in, especially towards the 360mm end, you do start to notice a bit of softness creeping in. Now don't get me wrong, it's far from being awful. In fact, the shots I captured were all perfectly usable, but you can certainly tell that this lens is being pushed pretty hard at this range. And to be fair, that's expected. You don't get a 15 times zoom in something this small without making a few sacrifices. But low light is where things get a bit more tricky, and it's not actually the sensor that's dropped a bollock here, it's actually the lens. Because whilst the sensor is a step up from your phone, the lens isn't particularly fast in terms of maximum aperture, tapping out at f3.3 at the wide end and f6.4 at the long end. And that means you basically got two options. You can either drop your shutter speed and risk motion blur, or crank the ISO and introduce noise. And much like a pair of strippers, one with meth teeth and the other one with a nasty yeast infection, neither option is particularly sexy. That said, if you keep your expectations realistic and stick to decent lighting, you can get some genuinely impressive results out of this camera. Plus, shooting in RAW definitely helps, because it gives you much more flexibility to fix things in post, especially with modern AI noise reduction, which actually does a pretty decent job. And speaking of editing, all of the photos you've seen so far have been graded using my very own custom-made Lightroom presets, which are available to purchase from my website for just a few dollars each. The best thing about them is they're designed specifically to work across pretty much any camera make or model, regardless of age, and they massively speed up your workflow whilst giving you clean, consistent results. You simply open up your RAW files, apply the preset, tweak a couple of sliders, and you're basically done. And if you want to try them out for yourself, I've put a link in the pinned comment below, along with a discount code for an extra 10% off your purchase. But anyway, this camera isn't just useful for stills, it also captures video too, so let's quickly talk about that. In a nutshell, you get 4K video recording up to 30 frames per second, and thanks to the stabilization, handheld footage is actually pretty usable even at the long end. But that's about where the praise ends, because there is a noticeable crop in 4K shooting, so you do lose that nice wide 24mm look, which is a bit of a shame. There's also no mic input, no headphone jack, no cold shoe port on the top for attaching accessories, and obviously, as we've already mentioned, there's no flip screen. So if you're planning on vlogging or doing anything even remotely serious curious, well, good luck with that. But let's now talk about price, because this is where things get a little interesting. At the time of filming, the TZ300 is priced at just under $900, which means it's slightly more than what the older TZ200 was selling for when that launched. Which, to be honest, is a little bit awkward because, as we've already established, this isn't exactly a massive upgrade. In fact, in some ways, it's actually a step backwards from the TZ200, most notably because it's had the EVF removed. So if that's the case, why did I state at the beginning of this video that this camera might just be one of the few point-and-shoot camera designs that's actually still trying to do something genuinely useful? Well, all of that becomes a bit more apparent when you start comparing it to what's already out there, because the truth is, there's barely anything else doing this. This is a pocketable camera with a 1-inch sensor and a 24 to 360mm zoom that you can throw in your jacket pocket and forget about. That combination is weirdly rare these days. Most alternatives either give you arguably better image quality but no zoom, like the Sony RX100 Mark VII or the Canon G7X Mark III. Or the other alternative is a camera that gives you loads of zoom but absolutely dog shit image quality, a bit like those tiny sensor bridge cameras that look great on paper until you actually see the photos they capture and you start wondering if you've accidentally stepped backwards in time to 2007. Or you end up buying a camera that just costs way too much money and you start questioning whether you should have taken up knitting instead, which, to be fair, now I think about it, has a lot in common with photography, mainly that you're still spending a lot of time dealing with pricks. But anyway, that's why this camera still makes a lot of sense to me, at least, because despite all of its quirks, it nails the one thing it was designed to do. It's convenient. It's the kind of camera you actually take around with you. And more importantly, it's the kind you actually use. And honestly, I would take that over a perfect camera I can't be asked to carry around with me any day, because unlike your mum's gym membership, at least this one will get used.